Well, generally speaking, I think that my music departs from a certain metaphor. It can be a musical one, or depart from something completely different. Stuff related to space, or to memory, perception, etc. But I usually depart from one single idea, and I think that my pieces stick to it in a certain way. I think my pieces are very monolithic in that sense. Not in the use of materials, but more in, like, I'm trying to solve a certain riddle, or to stick to some kind of issue that interests me.
And what was the issue for the end of lines, or the monolithic first idea?
Well, in that piece, let's say that the idea was to create a sort of living organism on the stage, so the musicians move on the stage along the paths or the ways of a map, basically. In a certain way, they move along the lines, or the fictitious lines of a sort of fleeing point structure. So they basically depart from one position and they move to the backstage or towards the conductor, which is on the fleeing point, let's say. So that's basically the whole idea of the piece.
But where did that idea come from? At the end of the lines, does it refer to the point where two parallel lines come together in space?
Yeah, exactly. It's well, that idea comes from perspective. Basically, it's something that you can find in painting or in architecture. I mean, I'm really interested also in the idea of doubles in space, and let's say same materials that change, or the reception changes depending on the place where they are located on space. That's why that piece concretely is quite poor when it comes to materials. I mean, there are very few materials which are repeated, but in different parts of the stage. So the idea of the piece is that the actual perception of those materials changes depending on the location.
Yeah, yeah. But the perception also, of course, is depending upon where you are as an audience, depending on where you are sitting.
Yeah,
so your
correct.
staging is very important, right?
It is very important. Of course, in a concert like the one we had last night, although the performance was really good, I think the space, it was performed in a church, actually. So it's a very complicated space to deal with. Among other things, the audience are sitting on the same level, so it's pretty hard to see what's actually going on the piece. But of course, you have to live with that. I mean, there's nothing you can do about it. But on the other hand, I'm happy about the acoustics of the hall and the backstage area that I'm using as well. That's something very beautiful in churches, that you have all sorts of sort of parallel spaces to the main hall, let's call it that way.
Yeah. Were there any examples in music history which inspired you to do this? Because, of course, there's a playing with the distribution of players in a church already in Renaissance music. And,
absolutely. No, that's like one of my favorite times in the history of music. It's the Venetian Renaissance, like the Gabrielis and Adrian Willard. So they divided the choirs on a church, basically, and that creates a sort of ambivalence between one focal point and the other. It's a mirror, but it's also it creates a musical structure or reality in which you don't know where the music is anymore. Is it in one point? Is it on the other one? Is it both points are reflecting each other? Or is it in the middle? Mm-hmm. I always found that very fascinating, and I mean, of course, those composers wrote for a very particular setup in a certain way to the San Marco Cathedral in Venice. The visual aspect is also important. I think that comes from the early experiences I had as a kid when I watched concerts at the TV was one of the only sources I had when I was a kid in Spain to watch concerts. So I always had this framed sort of experience of music. So that created a synergy between what you see and what you listen basically in a box. I'm really interested in this idea of placing things on stage, and especially placing the musician. I would say, like, this might sound a bit weird, but I'd like to treat the musician as an object, not as a character. I'm not really into. I think my music is not psychological in that sense, so that it's not really about the theatricality of the gesture or the theatricality of the performance, but about placing musicians on stage. It's more like the idea of creating sound objects which are animated in a certain way.
So you could imagine a piece which is completely performed by robots.
On one hand, what you're saying it's plausible, but I love the act of playing too. I mean, and I like the inequalities and the little gaps and cracks and the similarities that are achieved through the performance of an instrument. That's what keeps music alive in a certain way. But I mean, I have other pieces where I use these sort of parallel universes in the sense that I create a counterpoint between empty stages, or what I would say still lives, let's put it that way, and let's say segments of the stage which are animated by people who are actually playing. So that game between objects and performers is always sort of present in my music to a certain level. The ideal for me would be to have a job that consumes as little time as possible, so that I can devote all my time to actual composition. Now that job can be anything, actually. It doesn't need to be related to music. It's complicated at the moment. It's extremely complicated for composers and artists in general, so I'm also being realistic in a certain way. It is certainly a challenge, especially, I mean, I'm from Spain, so of course I feel that I won't be able to go back to my country, which is something I'm used to because I lived abroad for many years, but that already creates a layer of complexity in your life. So, because in a certain way, when you live abroad, you are in between places all the time, and of course you're from the place where you stay, but you don't, but you're not either. And that creates a conflict sometimes. I'm used to that conflict, and I think that's something that keeps me going in a certain way. But it's easier to stay in a place and not to move from there, but